April 18, 1945. The Ruhr Pocket, Western Germany. More than 500,000 exhausted soldiers, battle-tested veterans who had survived everything from Stalingrad to Normandy, made a choice that would have seemed impossible just months before. They gave up in massive numbers to American troops instead of continuing to fight or falling back to German territory. What the Americans had brought wasn't simply better weapons, it was something much more crushing. A calculated method of fighting that made resisting not only pointless, but completely senseless. April 4, 1945, early morning, east side of the Rhine River, Lipa area. The trap had closed. Field Marshal Walter Model, leader of Army Group B, stood inside his makeshift command post, staring at maps that showed something unbelievable. In only 12 days, American tank forces had accomplished what German military thinking said couldn't be done. They'd completely surrounded an entire army group, 325,000 fighting troops, plus support units, supply workers, and scattered soldiers, pushing the total past 430,000 men stuck in a zone about 50 miles across. But the raw numbers weren't what made this moment unique in war history. German troops had been trapped before, at Stalingrad, at Falaise, at countless smaller fights across both eastern and western battlefields. What made the Ruhr Pocket different was what came after, or actually what didn't come. There were no frantic attempts to break free, no suicidal final stands, no fanatic fighting until the last round. Instead, over the following 2 weeks, the biggest mass surrender on the Western Front would happen, and it would expose something that scared German commanders more than any bomb. Their troops had lost faith in fighting back. The Americans labeled their strategy vertical envelopment. But that cold phrase hid a revolution in combined warfare that had been refined through 3 years of fighting from North Africa to the Rhine. Major General J. Lawton Collins, leading the 7th Corps, had built a fighting method that didn't just beat German defenses, it made holding them mentally unbearable. The German soldiers stuck in the Ruhr had been told for years that American troops were weak, green, dependent on equipment rather than fighting ability. They'd been promised that German tactical mastery and stronger willpower would beat American factory production. Army Group B held veterans from the Eastern Front, men who'd lived through Kursk and Kiev, fighters who knew how to survive encirclements and had escaped before. Yet within days after the pocket formed, whole divisions were giving up without firing a single bullet. By April 18th, when Model dissolved Army Group B and freed his men from their promises, over 317,000 had already dropped their weapons. By the time the pocket was fully emptied on April 21st, American forces had handled 325,000 prisoners, with estimates showing total captures, including those who surrendered right after, topped 500,000 when counting attached Air Force, SS, and militia groups throughout the industrial Ruhr region. What the Germans faced wasn't a normal military force. It was a coordinated system of destruction running on principles they'd never encountered. Not from the Soviets, not from the British, not in any earlier campaign. The Americans had created something that military scholars would later see as a basic shift in warfare. The power to make continued fighting not just hard or expensive, but actually pointless. The weapon wasn't one piece of technology. It was the perfect blending of air power, tanks, artillery, supplies, and mental warfare into a machine that wore down not just German fighting ability, but German desire to fight. Every piece strengthened the others, creating a snowball effect that made each hour of resistance more useless than the one before. In his last message before dissolving Army Group B, Model wrote, "The Americans don't fight battles. They run industrial operations. Our men face not an army but a system. Bravery means nothing when the enemy can guess your every move, counter your every action, and make your position impossible before you even reach it." 3 weeks later, Model walked into the forest near Duisburg and killed himself. He left no note, but his assistant recorded his last words. "A field marshal doesn't surrender, and I can't ask my men to do what I won't." But his men had already decided. Not because they were afraid, but because they'd understood a truth their leaders wouldn't face. The Americans had invented a type of warfare where traditional military strengths, bravery, tactical talent, determination, became meaningless. You couldn't outfight a system that had already worked out every possible reaction. You couldn't outmaneuver troops that controlled every route. You couldn't outlast an enemy whose supply chain reached back to an untouched factory network an ocean away. The story of the Ruhr Pocket isn't about a fight. It's about the moment when industrial-age warfare hit its natural endpoint, when one side's methodical approach made the other side's continued resistance not just impossible, but senseless. 500,000 German soldiers didn't surrender because they lost in combat. They surrendered because they'd been made outdated. The German military, thinking that failed so completely in April 1945, had grown from victory. For 5 years, the Wehrmacht had conquered a continent using ideas that had proven brutally effective: speed, focused force, tactical adaptability, and the better training of individual soldiers and small unit leaders. The idea was mission-type tactics, where commanders at every level grasped the overall goal and had freedom to reach it through their own judgment. A German lieutenant could respond to battlefield changes faster than an American colonel could get orders from division command. This decentralized leadership had let German forces consistently outmaneuver bigger opponents. From Poland in 1939 to France in 1940, from the Balkans to the early fights in Russia, this system had worked brilliantly. German soldiers were thoroughly trained, with even basic infantry getting education that stressed independent thought and tactical awareness. A German squad leader had more power and training than many Allied platoon leaders. This built a military culture where small groups of men could achieve outsized results through better skill and independence. By 1943, despite growing losses and strategic setbacks, German tactical thinking still produced impressive wins. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, relatively small German forces had dealt embarrassing defeats to American units in their first big fight. The Germans had shown that even when outnumbered and outgunned, better tactics and veteran leadership could overcome equipment disadvantages. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, commanding Allied forces in North Africa, had been forced to reshape American training and thinking after Kasserine. The lessons were harsh but clear. American forces needed basic changes in how they approached fighting. Raw courage and factory output weren't enough against an enemy who could consistently outsmart and outmaneuver them at the tactical level. But the Germans had made a crucial mistake. They assumed that warfare would keep being decided by these tactical fights, that battles would be won by better-trained soldiers making better choices in individual gunfights. They believed that as long as German tactical excellence stayed superior, they could balance American equipment advantages. What they missed was that the Americans weren't trying to win tactical fights. They were building a system that would make tactical excellence meaningless. Between 1943 and 1945, the United States military went through a change that had no match in war history. It wasn't about building better individual soldiers, though American training did get much better. It was about building an integrated system where individual tactical choices mattered less than methodical operational dominance. The scale of American supply preparation was something the German military couldn't imagine. By early 1945, American forces in Western Europe were backed by a supply network that delivered 26,000 tons of supplies every day. Every American division crossing the Rhine had artillery backup that could send more tonnage in an hour than an entire German corps could fire in a day. But supplies alone don't explain the mental breakdown. The Soviets had huge material advantage on the Eastern Front, yet German forces kept fighting with desperate resolve even in hopeless spots. At Budapest, German and Hungarian forces held for 50 days in a siege that ended in nearly complete destruction. At Breslau, the garrison fought for 82 days, continuing resistance even after Hitler's death. Against the Americans, that same resolve vanished. The difference wasn't firepower. It was predictability and inevitability. American thinking had evolved into something the Germans called material battle, but that phrase didn't capture what made it mentally crushing. The Americans had built a methodical approach where every German action triggered a preset, overwhelming answer. Artillery watchers called in strikes within minutes. Air support showed up within an hour. Tank columns moved to cut off escape routes before German commanders even knew their positions were threatened. It wasn't that Americans predicted German moves through spying or brilliant command. They simply had enough resources to prepare for every possibility at the same time. Colonel General Alfred Jodl, operations chief of the German Armed Forces High Command, wrote in his diary in March 1945, "Against the Americans, our tactical thinking has become a trap. Every principle that worked well against the Poles, French, and even Soviets now hurts us. Our flexibility means nothing when the enemy has prepared answers to every choice. Our independence is pointless when every action triggers crushing payback. We're fighting an opponent who doesn't need to outsmart us." They've made thinking irrelevant. This was the situation that Army Group B entered when American forces crossed the Rhine. They brought tactical excellence, veteran leadership, and resolve to a fight where none of those qualities mattered anymore. They were ready for a battle. What they met was an industrial process designed to make battle impossible. The German defensive preparations in the Ruhr represented the peak of 5 years of hard-earned tactical knowledge. Army Group B wasn't a bunch of new recruits or broken garrison troops. It held the 116th Panzer Division, veterans of the Normandy campaign, the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, which had fought through Italy and France, the 338th Infantry Division, survivors of the Eastern Front. These weren't men who broke easily. General Gunther Blumentritt, commanding 1st Parachute Army inside the pocket, had personally watched over defensive preparations throughout January and February 1945. His planning papers, captured after the surrender, showed careful attention to lessons learned from 3 years of retreat. Every position had been placed with overlapping firing zones. Every bridge had explosive charges. Every crossroad had been marked for artillery. Every likely American approach had prepared defensive spots. The Ruhr industrial region itself gave natural advantages. The area held over 4,000 factories, countless mine tunnels, and urban zones perfect for defensive fighting. The ground was broken by rivers, canals, and industrial buildings that funneled any attacking force into predictable paths. German engineers had spent months preparing positions that would turn each factory, each city block, each river crossing into a kill zone. Intelligence reports captured from German divisional headquarters showed they understood American abilities. They knew about American artillery superiority. Their thinking called for instant spreading out when American forward spotters were seen. They knew about American air power. They planned moves during bad weather and prepared covered positions. They knew about American tank tactics. They prepared anti-tank positions in depth with carefully planned fallback routes. What made German commanders confident wasn't ignorance of American strength. It was faith in proven defensive thinking. The Manual for Static Defense, refined through years of combat, said that a properly prepared defensive position held by determined troops could cause losses of 3 to 5 attackers for every defender killed. The math seemed simple. Even if Americans had 3-to-1 advantage, attacking into prepared defenses should produce unbearable losses. Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Lee Corps, had survived North Africa, Normandy, and the Ardennes offensive. His after-battle reports consistently stressed the same idea. American forces would attack until losses became politically unacceptable, then stop to reorganize. The German aim wasn't to win. It was to make victory too costly. Every day of resistance bought time for wonder weapons, for peace talks, for some miracle that would prevent total defeat. The pocket's defenders had ammunition stored for weeks of combat. Food supplies had been gathered from the surrounding area. Medical facilities had been set up in the safest back areas. Communication networks linked every major position. On paper, Army Group B had everything needed for extended resistance. Colonel Wilhelm Wiebig, operations officer for the 15th Army, wrote in his journal on April 3rd, the day before encirclement, "The Americans will find the Ruhr a far different battle than their race across France. Here we fight from prepared positions with our backs to our homeland. Here their speed means nothing. They must come to us, and we will make them pay in blood for every kilometer. We have studied their methods. We know their patterns. We are ready." But every assumption in German planning held a fatal weakness. They'd prepared for a battle. They'd calculated for combat where tactical choices mattered, where ground gave advantage, where determination and skill could offset equipment inferiority. They'd built a fortress designed to survive siege warfare as understood by military traditions going back centuries. What they couldn't prepare for was an opponent who had evolved past battle entirely. The Americans hadn't come to fight for the Ruhr. They'd come to process it. And the difference between those two ideas, fighting versus processing, would become obvious within hours of the trap's completion. And once German soldiers grasped that difference, their carefully prepared defenses would become not fortresses, but cages. What the Americans used against the Ruhr pocket wasn't a secret weapon or revolutionary technology. It was something far more devastating. Methodical operational blending refined into a doctrine that military historians would later call synchronized warfare. The innovation wasn't in any single piece. It was in how every piece worked as parts of one machine. The concept had been built by Lieutenant General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group Staff during the winter of 1944. Operations. Officer Brigadier General Truman Thorson had created what he called the coordination system, a unified method where intelligence, artillery, air power, armor, and supplies ran on synchronized schedules that made German tactical responses predictable and therefore exploitable. April 5, 1945, late morning. First full day of the encirclement. The system turned on. American P-38 Lightning reconnaissance planes began flying a grid pattern over the whole pocket at exactly timed gaps. Every camera run was numbered and recorded. Photo readers at Nyack's Tactical Air Command headquarters got developed film within 2 hours of each flight. They weren't hunting for tanks or troop buildups. They were charting every German position, every movement, every supply pile, building a living picture of the entire defensive network. By early afternoon, the first pattern had shown up. German units were moving to defend the most obvious American approach paths exactly as doctrine required. American intelligence officers marked these positions on master maps and figured out something the Germans couldn't expect: the timing of German movements. Late afternoon, American artillery started firing on roads and junctions, not where German troops were, but where they would be in 30 minutes based on watched movement patterns. German commanders reported to Army Group B headquarters that American artillery seemed to predict their movements. They adjusted, moving at different times, using different paths. American photo reconnaissance recorded the changes. Artillery adjusted the same way. The mental impact was instant. German after-battle reports from those first days repeatedly used the word eerie. American fire seemed to know every movement. Units that moved at night found themselves under artillery fire at their new spots within hours. Supply trucks that changed routes discovered American fighter bombers waiting at backup crossroads. It wasn't spy superiority. It was methodical watching creating predictive patterns. Colonel Edwin Luther, commanding artillery for 7th Corps, had developed the time-on-target method to crushing perfection. When American spotters found a worthwhile target, Luther's system coordinated multiple artillery groups firing from different spots, timing shells to hit at the same instant. A German position might see a single test shot, figure they had minutes before the main bombardment, and try to move, only to have dozens of shells from 6 different directions arrive within a 5-second window. The size of American artillery was something German veterans couldn't grasp. The 3rd Armored Division alone had dedicated artillery backing equal to what the entire Wehrmacht army in the pocket could use. When 7th Corps called for corps-level artillery backing, over 300 guns could fire coordinated strikes. The Ruhr pocket held roughly 800 German artillery pieces. But poor ammunition and constant counter-battery fire meant fewer than 200 could fire at any given moment. But artillery was merely the anvil. The hammer was operational speed. American armored columns didn't attack German positions. They went around them. Using radio communications and aerial scouting, American commanders found gaps in German lines within hours of their forming. Tank columns would use these gaps before German reserves could respond, cutting off entire units from supply and communication. The 2nd Armored Division showed this on April 7th. Scouts found a 4-kilometer gap in German lines southeast of Ham. Within 3 hours, Combat Command A had pushed an entire armored column through the gap, moved 15 kilometers, and blocked the main supply route for 2 German divisions. The surrounded German forces discovered they were cut off only when supply trucks failed to show up. By then, American forces had set up blocking positions too strong to break without a major counterattack. And attacked German forces no longer had the fuel or coordination to launch. What made this mentally devastating wasn't just the encirclement, it was the timing. German tactical doctrine stressed rapid response to developing situations, but American operational speed moved faster than German decision cycles. By the time German commanders spotted a problem, sent orders, and started executing responses, American forces had already moved to the next phase. Lieutenant Karl Gottman, operations officer for the 116th Panzer Division, wrote in his journal on April 9th, "We are always responding to situations that have already changed. Our commanders make correct choices for circumstances that no longer exist. By the time orders reach forward units, the Americans have moved and the orders are useless. We are fighting yesterday's battle while they are already positioning for tomorrow's." The system wasn't flawless. American units still faced fierce resistance at key points, still took losses, still ran into situations where German tactical skill created local advantages. But those tactical wins meant nothing within the larger operational framework. A German company might successfully defend a crossroads for 6 hours, causing losses to American attacking units, only to discover American forces had already gone around the position entirely and cut off their escape route. April 12, 1945. The collapse began in earnest. What started as tactical defeats changed into system-wide breakdown within the German command structure. The breaking point wasn't any single fight. It was the building realization that continued resistance served no purpose. American intelligence teams working with captured German communications gear recorded the collapse in real time. Radio intercepts from German divisional headquarters showed a pattern. Initial confidence followed by confusion, then panic, finally acceptance. By April 14th, entire battalions were surrendering without American forces even coming near their positions. They simply walked out of their fortifications and waited for Americans to handle them. The 9th Panzer Division gives the clearest example. On April 10th, the division reported full combat readiness with 47 working tanks and 4,200 combat troops. Division Commander General Harold von Elverfeldt issued orders for aggressive counterattacks to restore German lines. On April 13th, after 3 days of trying to execute offensive operations, von Elverfeldt reported to Army Group B, "Every movement draws instant artillery fire. Every buildup draws air attack. We advance 500 meters. American armor appears on our sides. We cannot maneuver. We can only die in place or surrender." On April 15th, von Elverfeldt surrendered his division with 38 tanks still working and ammunition for 2 more days of combat. When questioned by American intelligence officers, he stated, "I surrendered not because we were beaten, but because fighting had become murder. I could achieve nothing except the death of my men." The mental studies done by U.S. Army psychiatrists with surrendered German troops showed common threads. Soldiers described a sense of powerlessness unlike anything felt on the Eastern Front. Against the Soviets, individual courage and tactical skill could change local situations. Against the Americans, nothing they did mattered. One German sergeant told questioners, "Against the Russians, a brave man might survive. Against the Americans, bravery just meant you died for nothing." The industrial side of American warfare showed itself in ways German soldiers found beyond understanding. American units that suffered losses got replacements within days. Equipment losses were replaced overnight. Ammunition spending that would have broken a German division for weeks was considered routine by American standards. The 3rd Armored Division fired more artillery shells on April 13th than the entire German pocket fired during the whole week. But the most mentally devastating aspect wasn't material advantage. It was the methodical certainty. American forces moved forward on predictable schedules. They pushed forward exactly as far as their supply lines would allow, then stopped to strengthen. They didn't rush, didn't take needless risks, didn't give chances for German counterattacks. They simply ground forward like a machine, impersonal and unstoppable. German soldiers started calling it steamroller war. There was no glory in it, no chance for heroism, no way for courage or skill to matter. You couldn't ambush a steamroller. You couldn't outmaneuver it. You could only wait for it to reach you and then be crushed or step aside. By April 16th, American forces had handled over 150,000 prisoners. The supply setup for managing surrenders became as advanced as combat operations. Prisoner handling stations ran on assembly line ideas. German soldiers were disarmed, recorded, given food and water, and moved to back areas within hours. The efficiency itself was disheartening. Americans handled the surrender of entire divisions with the same methodical efficiency they used for combat. Field Marshal. Model's headquarters kept communication until April 17th. His final operational orders showed a commander who understood the situation completely but couldn't bring himself to accept it. He authorized unit commanders to surrender if they judged continued resistance pointless, effectively dissolving his command while refusing to formally give up himself. On April 21st, the last organized German resistance in the pocket stopped. Final prisoner counts topped 325,000, the largest mass surrender in Western Front history. American losses during the whole operation: 10,000 wounded, 2,000 killed. German losses: roughly 10,000 killed in combat, the rest captured. The casualty ratio, normally helping defenders in prepared positions, had been completely flipped. The Eastern Front gave brutal context. In the Courland pocket, 200,000 German soldiers held out against Soviet forces until the war's end, suffering over 150,000 losses but never surrendering in mass. In the Heiligenbeil pocket, German forces fought for 2 months with 80% losses before final Soviet victory. Against the Soviets, Germans fought to complete destruction. Against the Americans, they chose survival. After-war studies by both American and German military historians marked the Ruhr pocket as the moment when industrial warfare hit its logical end. The Americans had built a system where human factors, courage, leadership, tactical skill, became operationally meaningless. Not because German soldiers lacked these qualities, but because the American system had evolved past the level where those qualities could shape results. General Eisenhower's report to the combined chiefs of staff said, "The Ruhr operation showed that properly applied industrial-age warfare can achieve decisive results with